Crispin Sartwell, it is good to see you again.
Daniel Kaufman, good to see you too.
Welcome to everyone in the Sophia audience, bloggingheads.tv, meaningoflife.tv. This is the Sophia program available on streaming video and audio podcast. I'm here with Crispin Sartwell, associate professor of philosophy at Dickinson College, now occupying different digs, just not very long ago, just published an essay in Standpoint magazine called Overrated, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And as the audience knows, that was bound to attract my attention. And so I said to Crispin, I said, "What you talking about, Crispin?"
Yeah.
And,
it's like the white supremacism thing, right?
And
it's worse maybe, though.
We're going to have him on. We're going to have you talk about this. All right. So was this something that they asked you to do? Is this something is this part of a series like your Why They Suck series, or?
Okay. It's kind of interesting, I guess. Not really, but yeah, I did a Why They Suck for Splice Today on Wittgenstein. They contacted me then that they wanted one for their Overrated series on Wittgenstein. I said I had already done it. They said they knew that. In fact, they based that series in Standpoint on Why They Suck.
No way, really?
Yeah. And they started with Harry Potter because I had done Harry Potter. Anyway, whatever. And then the editor was gone the next day after he commissioned the thing or something. So
left the operation?
Yeah, I think so.
That's weird.
I don't know if I had anything to do with that, but hey, I like your T-shirt, man. Black Flag. Yeah.
Hardcore. So, I want to ask you something before we get into the details, because something bothers me a little bit about the Why They Suck and the Overrated, and I guess I want to feel out from you, because I think you're so awesome. It's uncomfortable for me. I'm a little uncomfortable with this whole category, and I want to get a better sense of what you mean by it. Look, I understand the idea that of knocking down totems and not idolizing people and all that sort of stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But there also seems to me another side of it where one starts to display a serious lack of humility in the proper sense of the virtue. I'm not talking about, a phony kind of self-deprecation, but just more the sort of the healthy understanding that these people aren't stupid. These questions are very difficult, and in 100 years, people will still be reading them, and no one will know who the hell I am. I mean, sort of, just to kind of to give at least some credit to the fact that these have become major texts and people in the history of ideas, and that they've, to a good extent, helped shape the actual conversation that all of us are in.
Well, a lot of the Why They Suck, though, is about, Bob Dylan, Springsteen, you know what I mean? Most of it's not philosophy or literature.
Yeah. But I would say something about those. Yeah.
All right. So, I think that, I guess if that's, along the lines of that question, I think that people's reputations often do not reflect their quality. I think people get promoted willy-nilly, arbitrarily, often. After a while, you can't think about the history of whatever without them. So this is true of Dylan, for example, if you ask me. He should have just been an obscure folkie, okay? That, in my opinion, is the quality of his work. But we'll never be able to tell the story of the 60s, even, the whole social events and stuff like that of the period without Dylan, because they started immediately to tell it that way. Plato's, the fact that all philosophy is footnotes to Plato doesn't necessarily reflect the quality of Plato, but certain, kind of historical contingencies or someone's agenda at a certain moment, things like that. So I guess I'm not really impressed by or I'm suspicious about a lot of these historical reputations, and I don't think the test of time is particularly valid, actually.
Well, but it's not valid as an indicator of quality, which is wasn't really what I was suggesting. It's more that, and maybe the way that you now answered now focuses me a little bit. I guess what I was saying was, isn't it our job as scholars and analysts to address the history we actually have, as opposed to wishing we had a different history, right? I mean, I guess what I wonder about this is if there's a kind of it's a very easy kind of thing to do, but it's not going to change the fact that if you want to talk about music history, you have to talk about Bob Dylan. I mean, you could write 10,000 essays like this,
right?
The fact of the matter is, this is the history we actually have,
right? So one thing.
If we want to be critics and analysts, we have to actually deal with the history there is, not wish we had a different history, right?
No, we can try to retell the history. And I mean, one thing that means is that if I wrote 10,000 articles attacking Bob Dylan, his reputation would be completely intact. Like, the people who I am attacking, I feel like, are invulnerable, basically. You know, like, their reputations are solid gold. And I sort of don't think that they're, I mean, but it's also true that there's a certain there's an extreme intellectual arrogance in that pose of Wittgenstein sucks, you know? And I'm worried about that in myself. It's probably damaged my whole arc of my career in philosophy. Like, okay, so I was taking a graduate seminar with Cora Diamond on Wittgenstein. This is 87, maybe.
I kind of envy you for that.
yeah, and I didn't get enough out of it because I was really intent on ridiculing Wittgenstein and ridiculing his followers. Okay, and that didn't. I thought I was doing it in a good-humored, fun way, but provocative. But it didn't go over. Okay.
Well, look, here's where I completely agree with you. I think that the super defensive reaction is worse. I mean, look, he's not insulting your mother, for God's sake, right? You know what I mean? Yeah, I mean, people, sure. I do find the way that people tend to possess these things to be quite weird. I don't really quite understand it. I understand getting that impassioned over your sister or your kid I don't understand getting that impassioned over some musician that has no idea who the hell you are, right?
Right. It took me a long time to realize that if I insulted someone's favorite musician and, just straight up abuse kind of, that they would feel personally insulted.
But you might as well have insulted their mother, right? I mean, the last thing I want to say about this, and then we'll get into Wittgenstein, is in the Why They Suck, this whole mode, I detect something else, and that I wonder about, and that is, look, there's plenty of stuff I don't like. There's plenty of stuff I might even make fun of. My daughter and I have a constant back and forth where I'll make fun of music she's listening to just because, in my view, so terrible. But I do also have a kind of basic respect for other people in the following sense. I think highly of her.
Yeah.
And and this is something she really likes.
I've been through that too.
And so you are able to adopt. In other words, as long as the other person isn't being kind of a jerk about it, you are inclined somewhat to accept other people's tastes and not indirectly insult them by suggesting that somehow, well, I think this is terrible, so therefore, obviously, you have no taste at all, right? I mean, are you really kind of, screw you, man, your shit sucks, right? I mean,
okay. Well, I don't know if I've talked about this with you, but, I grew up in a family of brothers, and all of them music fanatics.
Oh, wow.
For one thing, okay?
Wow, yeah.
And, we would get stoned, drunk, whatever, and argue all night.
Fight to the death about music.
Yeah, and just insult, just mint the worst insults we could imagine for the people the other people like, And that kind of it's like that kind of culture infested my brain, so that to me, it seems fun, okay? I sort of want someone to come back at me in a spirit of fun. I'm trying to be funny, have fun.
Yeah, and that I think is a perfectly healthy thing to do. The fact that others are so deadpan in the reaction is, I think, a problem. I guess I just wasn't entirely sure of your intentions. Yeah. And now that it's sort of clear that you're kind of as a young boy would do, daring somebody to fight you, right? And
yes,
I actually quite like that. And I wish that, it's difficult to be the only one who's being playful.
Yes.
And as we both know, in today's climate, nobody is willing to be playful, right? I mean, it's just... So.
Yes. And in grad school, I was continuously playful, and I always thought it was going to go over, Like, just like, man, oh, man. They took that so seriously.
I actually think if you'd been in grad school now, I'm not sure you would have made it through. I mean,
I think so, too.
And I don't think I would have. And I'm even not as much of a bomb thrower as you, but people are so prickly, it's impossible.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get started. Maybe first, it seemed to me that the Standpoint piece focused a lot on personality, on Wittgenstein's impact on people as a personality.
Yeah.
Now, I guess what I want to ask you is sort of, is that the bulk of your critique of him? Is there a more substantive side to it, which you think he's overrated? Excuse me. Do we want to sort of address philosophers and philosophies primarily by the character of their proponents, given that so many fucked up people, right? I mean, do philosophy.
Yes.
Maybe talk around what you were trying to do there and what your attitude is.
Yeah. No, that's true. It kind of focused on his personality. I mean, I think that bears on the philosophy, and the writing, we could talk about that in various ways. But I think you're right to separate those out provisionally. It's not like I'm, morally assessing, Hegel or something like that for every action. I mean, I'll just say autobiographically again, like, okay, when I was studying at University of Virginia in the 80s, Cora Diamond was there. Renford Bambro was visiting, that was a British philosopher who knew Wittgenstein. Rorty, probably Wittgenstein might have been his biggest hero. There's a couple other candidates, Dewey and Heidegger, maybe. There was, and it felt like a cult in a way. I mean, especially when you're dealing with Cora Diamond and folks like that. Like, the only question appeared to be, what did Wittgenstein really mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Like, there wasn't a question like, what's the best position here, or what arguments can you give? But what did Wittgenstein really mean was the way you answered any significant question.
Yeah.
Also, I think, I was rebelling very severely against Rorty, and so that involved rebelling, at least to some extent, against Wittgenstein as he read him. Although certainly I think, like, his reading is slanted in a certain way. Almost. I
was going to say, do you think Rorty read Wittgenstein correctly?
Yes and no. I mean, he read him tendentiously. He read him as agreeing with everything that Rorty believed.
I felt like Rorty read everything in the history of philosophy in a kind of an absorption kind of. And by the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with that as long as you're clear and that's what you're doing, right? I mean,
he's not clear,
strictly speaking, doing the history of ideas, but you're kind of pulling all these threads that you think comprise maybe an articulable tradition that you think is a good one, right? I mean,
right. His basic purpose was not to get Wittgenstein right, but to annex him to his project.
I felt like he did that with Davidson.
Yeah.
The only awkward thing was that Davidson was a contemporary, and so when you saw them, there was dialogues with them, you realize how different they are.
Yes.
If you read Rorty, you might think that Rorty's a Davidsonian, and I don't really think he is, right? I mean,
and to some extent, I had to come out from that spell and kind of realize that there's a Rorty Dewey, and then there's other Deweys, and and that's what he was doing. But Rorty, I guess Rorty's basic view, as I saw it at the time anyway, was that we are trapped in language, and there is no exit into the world from language. And he read Wittgenstein as asserting that, at least within the realm of philosophy in some sense, okay? And then Rorty also argued that philosophy was over maybe Wittgenstein was the last gasp or just after the last gasp. And that Wittgenstein had shown that there were no substantive problems or even articulable problems in philosophy. And, that therefore philosophy should be replaced by poetry or fiction writing and stuff like that. If you were dealing with Core Diamond, even, what could be a legitimate philosophical project, like for a dissertation or whatever, was unbelievably restricted to examination of, meaning of terms in this Wittgensteinian way, melting rather than addressing philosophical problems through linguistic analysis. So I was in this atmosphere where I didn't even think, I went into it because I love philosophy, all right? And then I found out that this is it's completely over. It's been over for decades. And that all that's left is kind of, to talk to the grave diggers or whatever, And so I almost felt at a certain point like I just needed to destroy Wittgenstein. Like it was just like, because he was destroying my, my discipline that I loved or whatever,
what's interesting though is that, and I'm sure you know this as well as I do, but early in the days of this program, I had a Wittgenstein scholar on. He's an old friend of mine. We go back almost 20 years now. In the UK, his name is Ian Ground, and we were talking about how the fact that Wittgenstein actually has almost zero influence in analytic philosophy today. And what's sort of interesting is the way in which your experience represented the last gasp of the dominance of that paradigm. All you had to do was wait 5 minutes and he would have vanished, right? And so I guess that also puzzled me a little bit about why you're going after the guy now when, the number of Wittgensteinians, they're basically like, 3 philosophy hobos wandering around, the Peter Hacker and like 2 other people. Right, wandering around, trying to sort of, we're still here. But my impression is that philosophy is completely, at least analytic philosophy, is completely went beyond him, primarily as evinced by the obsession with cognitive science and with the whole predicate on which is the opposite. The whole predicate on which is exactly what Wittgenstein thought you shouldn't do.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I think it's so important to bring Wittgenstein back is I think that that's one of the worst wrong turns philosophy's ever taken.
I agree with you.
The cognitive revolution.
I agree.
I was a little puzzled as to why you're going after him now when, he's like the dead parrot in the Monty Python sketch, right? He's done, man. You're more likely to hear him in a lit crit environment than you are here, right? In philosophy.
Well, I should really look. I think he's still read and respected in various ways. I guess we're still going back to the 80s, but like Kripke on rule following and stuff like that.
That's 40 years old.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Me doing these overrated and why they suck things, I'm pulling back on things I hated in decades past, okay? I don't care about Bruce Springsteen.
Bob Dylan is not recent, yeah.
Yeah, and my resentment is not recent.
Yeah.
A lot of these things I cultivated as a teenager, but I think a lot of philosophers would, if you ask them, and analytic philosophers, what is the greatest work of the 20th century? I still think philosophical investigations might come out number 1 or something.
Yes, when you look at surveys.
Yeah.
It would be that. It would be Rawls's theory of justice. There would be 3 or 4 things that might word and object, naming and necessity, right? These will be the names that come up. And look, it was a very philosophy of language heavy century.
Yes.
And I think for the most part that was a good thing. I know that you don't. And actually, one of the things we were going to talk about that we kind of lost, which I'm going to make sure we do talk about in the future, is each of our estimations of the linguistic turn, right? Because it was hugely. Basically, all the different areas of philosophy now got re-examined through a linguistic idiom, right? Metaphysics now is basically philosophy of language, right?
Yeah, and this is true in continental too.
Yeah.
In the 20th century.
Yeah.
And I don't reject the emphasis on language. I reject the exclusive emphasis on language.
Yeah.
The hypnosis by language. I think a lot of great work emerged from that, actually, and a lot of people got a lot clearer on a lot of things, and it enabled them actually to address more usefully some of these traditional philosophical questions too.
Yeah.
Or melt them away.
It's funny. I think of the 20th century in philosophy very much like I think of the 20th century in art. I do think that period, basically, from Moore and Russell through, let's say, Kripke, is some of the best philosophy that's ever been done in the entire history. Just like I
don't deny that.
I feel like that relatively small arc period in which you get the German expressionists, the Fauvists, is one of the greatest periods in painting. And
yeah, all right.
And then the question becomes the details. Now, look, maybe we want to dispense with this thing of personality quite quickly. I mean, clearly Wittgenstein was kind of a horrible guy, right? You read that You read that Wittgenstein's poker book. I mean, it's pretty clear the man was kind of a lunatic. Quite abusive to students in a way that we just simply don't accept. The only area we accept that kind of abusiveness to students still is in performing arts, which I don't understand. But anyway, I don't understand why it's still accepted. Because if any of us behaved that way, we'd be fired instantly. So I guess I'm willing to sort of concede. Okay, terrible guy, very weird and eccentric, and the unhealthy obsession with him as a personality is also bad. But that still leaves the philosophy, right?
Okay, fair enough.
Heidegger was a fucking Nazi.
Yeah.
But that still leaves the philosophy, right?
Yeah, it's true. Some of it, anyway.
What's your problem with the philosophy? Because I know you don't just dismiss him on the personality. I know you have a problem with the philosophy. So could you articulate maybe in a general sense, and then we'll go into some of the specific areas?
Sure.
What's your problem with the philosophy? And obviously there's the earlier and the later. I don't know if you want to disambiguate the Tractatus from the Investigations or you just want to talk as a whole. What's your problem with it philosophically?
Right, but this is going to stay fairly meta. It's the kind of thing I was saying before. It's like the sense of entrappedness in language. Also, I guess, maybe this is all ancillary, but the style in which it is presented also annoys me.
Okay.
Right? I can see how someone might be charmed by it. Really, or seduced by it, or it almost seems humble. But after I read like 10, 20, 30 pages of rhetorical questions that where after a while I'm not sure what he thinks the answers are, or he's just like throwing up more questions. Or many passages where I don't think that the goal is clarity whatsoever. But that can be okay because he's saying that these things are much more complicated and subtle than we are thinking they are. But still, I think that, or then philosophy presents them as being like these questions about meaning.
Right.
For example, like we're going to have to make this a lot more complex before we offer any sort of account, if we ever do, right? And I respect that because I think that's true. I've just been rereading the Investigations, and there's a lot I like about it, actually, and more that I like about it now than I did in 87, too. So I guess for me, the baleful philosophical effects have to do with this kind of entrapness in language and the characterization of philosophy. Philosophy has got to be over if the philosophical Investigations is accurate, right? Like there's nothing in philosophy except showing that philosophical problems are not really problems. And once you're done with that, surely you're done with philosophy on this conception. Like the metaphilosophical stuff here, like in the low 100s.
You'll have to read it because I did not bring a copy with me. So
yeah. Let let's see. I mean, I got some little notes here about things I could talk about. So like 109, Philosophical Investigations 109. We must do away with all explanation, and description alone must take its place, and this description gets its light, that is to say, its purpose, from the philosophical problems. These are, of course, not empirical problems. They are solved, rather, by looking into the workings of our language, and that in such a way as to make us recognize these workings, in despite of an urge to misunderstand them. The problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have always known. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language.
Right.
All right. And it's a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by language in philosophy.
Right.
Like exclusively.
And he says, he says things like, philosophy begins when language goes on holiday. I mean,
yes.
all this stuff. Okay, so there's two things that you just laid out. One is the sort of idea that philosophical problems are largely illusions that are created by either misunderstanding the different uses of ordinary language, or confusing ordinary language with technical language, and so on and so forth.
This is direct. I think it directly inherits the positivists.
Right, and the other side of it is that you just like the gnomic kind of rhetorical, somewhat mysterious kind of quality to it. And so let's just take both of those just to begin with.
Okay.
So the idea that philosophical problems, and let's just say in my case, what I would want to say is often, not always, but the idea that philosophical problems often are the result of confusions regarding uses of language. Now, that's an idea that not just Wittgenstein runs with, but that the ordinary language philosophers run with. And as you've said in the past, you're a big fan of J.L. Austin.
Yes.
I guess I don't understand on that front what you dislike about Wittgenstein's doing it this way, and Austin's doing it that way. I mean, Austin, in Sense and Sensibilia, tries to pretty much dissolve and erase an entire area of epistemological inquiry, right?
Yes.
Specifically, sort of foundationalist style theories of warrant.
Sense data theory,
illusion arguments against realism, against direct realism, and you are a direct realist.
Yes, sense data theory or whatever.
Right, and so I guess I don't understand why when Austin does it you like it, and when Wittgenstein does it you think it's overrated.
I don't think Austin. I should look back at this, and I imagine maybe he says things along these lines, but I should look.
Well, he doesn't make metaphilosophical statements like that, but he does it, right?
Yes.
I mean, he.
Right, so show me is, I guess, the thing. And, Wittgenstein does that too. He gets a lot out of this. But I think like his own hostility toward the whole philosophical, I think of Austin as pursuing philosophical questions through the means of linguistic analysis or whatever. So, I think I read him, although this might not be right actually, but I read him as going directly against sense data theory, attacking it.
Yes.
And like opening up the way for a different account of perception.
Specifically going after A.J. Ayer's problem of knowledge, yeah.
Yes. But Wittgenstein, I don't think he thinks like assertion about sense data or something like that, or like the idea is meaningful at all. Or in that it should or could be refuted. So I guess I see him as more distant. Look, I find Austin's writing more charming. But I think Austin is less distant from the tradition in the sense that he's more directly engaged in some of those questions. I also think like the linguistic analysis in some ways is like the performative stuff, speech act theory, is sharper in the sense that it's quite a bit clearer. It
also is a positive contribution. It's not. It is. He's offering a positive account of something as opposed to simply dismantling or undermining or.
But I could see that as a legitimate project. I mean, the dismantling can be a legitimate project.
Yeah.
But I also think that it's ultimately for Wittgenstein, this is an a priori assertion of some kind that philosophy is nonsense. I don't think that there's any real, unless you get the whole machinery of the Tractatus behind you.
I don't know if I think that that's an unargued assumption. I think it's a combination of a reaction.
Yes.
And something you say if you're coming from a particular frame. And so, look.
Yes.
I mean, part of this, you do have to go back to the Tractatus, because one of the things that, that puzzles people so much is you have this whole thing, and then you have this statement at the very end, right? Which completely, it's almost like an M. Night Shyamalan movie. It completely turns around, right? You thought this guy, look, this fooled all the positivists. They were ready to take Wittgenstein and give him a little crown and parade him around. And Wittgenstein's like, you completely misunderstood what I was saying, right? And this this is why I actually wonder why you are so animated against him, is because it's not that Wittgenstein is saying that those things that we cannot discuss philosophically are not significant or don't exist or whatever. He actually says the opposite. He says, actually, that's all the really important stuff. The stuff that can't be said but only shown, right? Now, Look, I think that let's be sort of, straight with each other. I actually think that's a very deep insight. I think we wildly overrate just how much can be demonstrated to others about things that really matter. Sometimes, and causes tremendous frustration. And I think if people adopted a bit more of a Wittgensteinian attitude, there actually would be less conflict on these sorts of things, right? Because you get so frustrated that you can't get the person to agree with you because they're not accepting your arguments or your proofs or whatever. And that's because what you're trying to persuade them of is something that you can only come to see. This is especially big in aesthetics. Think about Frank Sibley, right? You can't demonstrate to somebody that something has a certain aesthetic quality. They have to see it. Now, there's ways you can try and help them to see it.
Yes.
And I guess that part of what I like about Wittgenstein is he actually understands that on very many important things, you may never be able to get someone to see it, and you will never philosophically convince them of it because it's not that kind of thing.
Yes.
Now, what's wrong with isn't that a lot of what he's doing? Is sort of trying to show you in all these places where philosophers have mistakenly thought that you can kind of grind these things out intellectually and thus get other people, but that really, with most of the things that really matter to us, you either share a sensibility or you don't, right?
Okay, so first of all, if that really is the point of the Tractatus, he left it to the last sentence, right? Didn't he? I mean,
because he wanted to show what you could do in philosophy. He gave it the best version he could, and what he realized was how limited it was, right?
Right. Okay, so look, man, I think that the first thing I want to say is we talk about that kind of stuff all the time. All right, I don't even know what he's talking about. If he's saying that aesthetics, ethics, religion are things that cannot be spoken.
Well, we can talk about them. When's the last time you convinced somebody to like something? When was the last time you talked somebody into enjoying or liking something? They have to. All you can do is show it to them, right?
Yes, completely. Okay, that's completely true. But why would you start out with this a priori? We can't talk about this. We can't talk about that. We can't talk this way. We can't talk that way. We'll never be able to elucidate this whole area because it's not even discussable. Or let's talk about the ways language interacts with gestures, demonstrations, walking around and stuff like that.
That's the investigation. That's the investigations, right? So in other words, he exposed the limitations of the picture theory of meaning in the Tractatus, right? And then he said, okay, obviously this is not how language works, right? And in the investigations, he tries to look at language, at a much more ground level in terms of how it actually, the actual function of it, with all the stuff that you just mentioned.
Right. Look, if I'm a writer, okay, if my job is writing, and this is all stuff that cannot be written, all the topics that matter are things that cannot be written about. First of all, That's false, man. And then second of all, why are you a priori going to do this to me? Okay. And I think he thought that too, eventually, maybe. Although he's not really back in ethics and aesthetics very much in the investigations or something like that.
No, there's some lectures on aesthetics that are basically notes that G.E. Moore took in lectures that he did.
Yeah.
But I suspect that because those are areas where you have to see it, you can't be convinced into it, is probably the most plausible. If you're going to accept it anywhere at all, it's probably the most plausible, right? I can't convince you that something is delicate. You either perceive its delicacy or not, right?
No, you can convince me. I've been convinced of all kinds of stuff. I mean, I've just been dating a painter for the last 5 years, okay? And we've been to like every museum in the world, kind of, not really, but many. And she's changed me on a number of things.
By way of arguments?
Sometimes. She's not a very arguey person. Okay, but
listen, if you have a refutation of Frank Sibley's arguments regarding the ascription of aesthetic properties, you can become a very famous man. I mean, I'd like to hear it.
That kind of stuff never helped me get
this stuff for 25 years, and I'll tell you right now, I still don't see any way that you can actually deduce or otherwise infer an aesthetic property from a set of underlying descriptive ones. And that's what you'd have to be able to do in order to be able to philosophically convince something that something is delicate or beautiful, right?
No, okay. In the real context in which you can do that, you're tossing around aesthetic concepts, but you're in conversation with someone. You're in a space in front of an object, gesturing and stuff like this.
Right.
And the words are part of that whole interaction. And of course we can elucidate aesthetic concepts, wave at them, elaborately describe works of art, show each other that we've misunderstood works of art. I have had that experience. Even though, I do why they suck or whatever, I might seem unpersuadable.
But that is getting you to see something. That's not convincing you of something in the philosophical sense. I mean, that is getting you to see something that you hadn't seen previously. Now, part of the way you might do it is by describing the picture in different ways, drawing their attention to different parts of the picture, whatever.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, that is not the same as demonstrating something through an argument.
No, but philosophy is more than just a series of arguments on the page too. I don't know why people are so hostile toward philosophy, like at that moment, like Wittgenstein or whatever. Like, okay, when Moore goes, here's a hand and here's another, he is in a physical space, demonstrating, gesturing. That's part of his discourse, okay? Now, a hand cannot be said. A hand can only be shown. But that can be embedded in an entire course of linguistic, argumentation or whatever, giving reasons and so on. And not only that, but I think that Moore, I don't know if we talked about this, but when Moore gives a philosophical lecture, that is an ordinary context. Okay? Like there's nothing supernaturally bizarre about that. I've given hundreds of philosophical lectures. You have too, man. And you're still a physical body in physical space. You're still gesturing. You have intonations. Here is a hand, honestly, means exactly the same thing coming out of Moore's mouth as it would, in another context, if you could dream up another context. I think philosophy should not be separated from ordinary language and then condemned on that basis. It seems fairly ordinary to me, or it's an extension of ordinary language in various ways, or it might contradict that and float free or something like that. Let's bring it back with, some reasons and stuff like that.
It's just interesting that you say that because, I, for one, have always tended to. So Stanley Rosen, late Stanley Rosen, was a professor at Yale, and really a very good philosopher. I think he mostly was a classicist, but he has a collection of works called Metaphysics in Ordinary Language that I really think is amazing. And one of the things he describes philosophy as extraordinary speech. And this is part of his argument for why ultimately we cannot get outside of or beyond common sense, because in a sense, It's the frame, it's the standard of adequacy against which we deem all forms of extraordinary speech. Otherwise, they just turn into poetry, right? I mean, there has to be, and this is actually gonna come up when we talk about uncertainty, which I hope we're gonna get to not too long from now. But it's interesting that you say what you just said, because Austin, the whole point of his critique in Sense and Sensibilia of air is that air and all the other positivists, right, are using terms in extraordinary rather than ordinary senses, right? And so right. I guess I'd want to hear a lot more before I accepted the idea that philosophers, as they traditionally ply their trade, are employing ordinary rather than extraordinary speech, right?
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, there's a spectrum there, I guess, of course, I guess there are philosophers who've introduced entire kind of technical vocabularies that didn't exist before. Someone like even Hegel or Heidegger is probably, doing that, or Derrida.
But even normal words like illusion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Austin kind of shows how the philosophical use of that term, or reality, or real, or physical material object, right? I mean, all these things. This is all the way. This takes you back to Descartes, right? I mean, this takes you back to. That's a pretty. I mean, I'm not denying that there's nobody in the history of ideas who sort of employed these kinds of terms in their ordinary senses. But I thought it was the whole point of the ordinary language critique that that's not the case. And that's part of the reason why we get these bewitchments, right? Is that philosophers are using regular words in very odd ways, right?
Well, when let's say Descartes uses the word dream. All right, I should look back at Sense and Sensibilia, but I don't think that my basic idea on this is that, and I'm just about to teach, the meditations yet again, is he means by dream just what we mean by it. I mean, or just what Freud means by it, or just what a person in a cafe talking about what their dream last night means by it. I think that if we're talking about illusions, the problem isn't probably, in that case, the meaning, the use of the term illusion, but, investigating what we do mean by illusion as a way to heal the idea, for example, that the whole world could be an illusion. I don't think that of those as senseless. I believe I understand them. So when Descartes says, like, how do I know I'm not dreaming right now? I'm not sitting there going like, I don't understand how you're using those words, man. I think he's using them just, Now there could be deviant or technical terms. There could be cases where language leads you very far astray, like you have a certain definition or characterization or reconstrual of a particular term that, like maybe the way Hegel uses the word absolute or something like that, but I think I'm not sure why philosophy hates itself this bad. Like why it thinks that, I don't think language is on a holiday every time out in every philosophical sentence for 2,000 years.
No, neither do I. And look, neither do I. And that's the extent to which, I don't take on, I don't have heroes, right? I mean, if I say something like I'm a Wittgensteinian, I don't mean what a lot of people mean by it. I'm more, look, in this sense, I'm a bit more like Rorty in that I want to pull what I think is the really strong stuff from everywhere I go. And it just so happens that I find a lot of the stuff in this tradition very strong.
Yes.
I certainly don't accept it wholesale. I've actually written pieces in which, I've pointed to the sort of limits of the kind of Wittgensteinian analysis. I've sort of tried to talk a little bit about why maybe in some sense ultimately it's not completely satisfying. And so I'm not some kind of slavish devotee. I'm certainly not as much of a partisan as Cora Diamond is.
I basically accept ordinary language philosophy in the sense that I think if we're trying to say what a term means, we're trying to say what we mean by it when we exchange it in ordinary context. Like, I think that's the best way to elucidate the meaning of a term. Maybe the only way really to find out, explore what we actually do already mean by it, rather than what it should mean or what it, as a Platonic form, what it is or something like that.
Yeah.
But I'm not into the strict segregation, like the positivists and all that, of metaphysical from ordinary talk or something like that. Or I'm not willing to consign philosophy as a whole to a non-ordinary and thus nonsensical status. I think the words in philosophy, first of all, they come from ordinary usage. And second of all, if you want to figure out what those words mean, you have to bring them back to ordinary usage. I don't feel in my own life like me, the philosopher, is completely detached from me, like the ordinary agent trying to run around the world. I don't feel like my vocabulary, I use the same terms in both contexts many a time, and I don't feel like I'm sliding into a completely different use or a kind of metaphysical theory or something like that,
This is very interesting. I'm starting to see, I know now where we're different. I mean, I really do. I mean, I it's this, and this is, I didn't expect to go here. This is wonderful in the sense it's completely spontaneous and wasn't on the menu. I think the philosophical mode is very unnatural, and I'm very. I think it has a much more limited use than philosophers think it does.
Okay.
Especially in areas having to do with value, right? And with areas that are essentially normative.
Okay.
And not only do I think this intellectually, but I feel it in the course of my life. I mean, there is nothing that annoys people more. And I mean well-meaning people. I don't mean people that are trying to win something, right? I'm talking and trying to find anything they can to sort of win with, but I mean earnest people. There's nothing more that annoys people more than when you're trying to have a conversation about real feelings or real experiences or relationships or whatever, and somebody starts pulling, I get, if somebody's not, when somebody starts sort of pulling out philosophical arguments about why I shouldn't eat my lunch, I start to get very angry. I'm just like, you are abusing a certain kind of technical apparatus.
Yeah.
And employing it in places where A, it doesn't belong, and B, where nobody freaking wants it. Okay.
Right. And this was a factor in my very couple of my marriages, man. It's like, if I'm going to take
people will divorce you over this, right?
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Because it is a way of being a fucking asshole, it seems.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. And look, I think it has its place, but there's nothing to me that's more annoying than the person who leads their life in an overly self-consciously, philosophically rigorous kind of way. I dislike the application of these theories to ordinary life in a way that strikes me as very ham-fisted, right?
Right.
Maybe that's a difference, but you see much more of integration. A lot, and in your sense, you're much more like an ancient Greek thinker, right? I mean, I view philosophy as a highly specific technical activity that has a very limited series of uses.
Right.
And that for the most part, when it goes outside of them, it not only gets things wrong, but alienates people, right?
You could take someone like Dewey, right, who has the same kind of misgivings. And he asserts, like, okay, so if this stuff doesn't like help us in our lives, if it doesn't change our lives together or something in some practically useful way, then let's just forget it. And the words mean, whatever gets us to that point or something like that. If we're evaluating meaning for Dewey, we're like evaluating how this projects out usefully into the future or something like that. Like, you could philosophically argue that philosophy should be more grounded, more practical, more human. That the kind of, I would like argue with Kierkegaard, for example, or somebody like that. Like, it's gotten way too abstract in Hegel or something. We need to bring this back to the concrete conditions of our lives. But that seems to me within the philosophical discourse.
Right.
I guess in my own life, I kind of felt that, I mean, it feels natural to me or inevitable, right? Like, or it feels like very me-ish. Like I'm just going to, so any like political conversation from very early in my life is liable to drive me into like very general normative questions. It feels natural. It feels like we're still discussing the same thing, but at a higher level or something, or a different level or a more generalized way. And then we can bring that back to specific moments or issues or something. And, you know, and I guess, but I was like kind of bereft or stranded in 87 or whatever by this distinction, which ends up condemning philosophy as a whole as meaningless, you know, or over or whatever. I don't know. I'm not sure we're going to really, this is pretty rich meta philosophy.
Well, that I don't disagree with. I mean, that's the point at which I get off the bus, right? I mean, I'm teaching philosophy, right? I'm writing it.
Right.
So obviously I don't agree with Wittgenstein that everything is gone. But this deep question about, you know, you can go two ways with this, right? And it seems like you go one way and I go the other. One way is to say, look, yes, philosophy has become this very specific, technical, of limited though powerful use, very unnatural sort of speech. And so we should curtail it. And then when we do all the other things, we should sort of, you know, be more instinctive, more intuitive, more sort of, you know, integrated in the way we approach it. Or you could say, well, what that shows is that philosophy has to be brought back.
Yes.
Right? We need to bring, and in a sense,
yes.
I guess maybe extensionally they wind up being somewhat the same.
Yes.
Right?
It's sort of verbal, right?
Yeah. One more thing, just while we're on this more general footing, right? And because I also think that this is another sort of hinge point, which may explain the differences between us. I'm just curious how you feel about Hume. And the reason I say this is because I actually think that not in terms of their way they do anything, but actually in terms of the role, the function, Hume and Wittgenstein are very similar. And so I'm wondering if you have similar feelings about Hume that you have about Wittgenstein, not the personal stuff,
right,
but in terms of the impact of the philosophies being ultimately negative. Do you feel the same way about Hume? And I'll say why in a minute, but I first want to hear how you feel about him without me saying it.
Well, I love Hume in the sense I love reading Hume.
He writes very well, yes.
Yeah, he writes so beautifully.
Yeah.
I read Hume. I mean, I haven't quite thought about Hume with regard to all these issues, but I would read Hume as, yeah, I guess that's true. Like he distinguishes philosophical from ordinary uses of the same terms and stuff like that. And he distinguishes himself as a philosopher from himself as an ordinary agent, right? Like,
and he elevates the ordinary. He says the ordinary
yes.
agent must always take precedent.
Yes.
And that philosophy is what you do in the study, and when you leave it, you do humanity, and they're
right.
not the same, right?
Right. And my impulse right there is to say, no, man, you've got to bring those together, or you're just sitting in hypocrisy, or you're just sitting in contradiction.
Now that I don't get. Why is it? In other words, why is it?
Like,
let me say what I think. Let me say what I think it is, and you can tell me why it's really hypocrisy, right? Look. What Hume is trying to do is say, look, this is how far a rationalistic, small r, rationalistic analysis can get you, right?
Right.
And if you look at how far it gets you, it tends to get you ultimately to skeptical points, right? Now, you have a decision at that point. You can either, in a sense, double down and stick to your guns, which is going to cause you both to think and act very oddly, okay? Or you can recognize that you've reached the limits of human reason, and thus place that kind of analysis in its proper place in the overall landscape of a human life, right? It's not that there's no reason or call for self-reflection, for rational self-examination. The point is that one has to recognize at what point it ceases to be fruitful and now starts to be, and I don't see why is that hypocritical?
Well, I mean, just in a very direct sense, does he doubt or believe induction? You know what I mean?
He believes that you can only rationally ground induction up to a certain point, after which there is an element of either simply instinctive or habitual or natural. And they had a very crude conception of the natural then, obviously. And that one has to understand that that's the kind of being one is, right?
Yes.
In other words, it seems to me that the other view has a very mistaken sort of human anthropology, right? It assumes we're far more rational than we are, right? And it assumes that far more of the things we do are rationally scrutable than actually are, right?
Yeah, but I mean, of course, you don't want to prematurely say that something is not rationally scrutable.
No,
right?
no.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe Hume went really far and really convincingly on showing that it's not, or whatever, like with induction or whatever it might be.
Or causality or personal identity or,
yes.
or
right, or anything else, almost, or anything philosophical. So, I mean, I guess if I was trying to tell Hume what I would wish he would do, it'd be, okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. How would you prefer to use what you do think Hume is correct about in terms of...
Yes. And I mean, I try to do this in Entanglements or whatever. Okay, so like, say his sincere belief is that the order of nature is regular. Things follow one another. Predictably, according to the principles of induction or whatever, probability and so on. Okay, you are obliged, if that is your considered opinion as an agent, you're obliged as a philosopher to try to work out how that can be. Okay? Your task as a philosopher is, in my opinion, maybe to give philosophical underpinnings to what you actually do believe. Now, you might have to retreat on the methodology a little bit. In other words, okay, if you're thinking like this, it's the hyper-rigorous methodology of deductive reasoning that led you to this skeptical conclusion, which contradicts your entire experience as a human being, then you're going to have to fix the rigorous reasoning, either de-rigorize it, like come up with a different philosophical method, or really work that rigorous method in another direction, which I feel like you probably can, actually, because you're David freaking Hume, or whatever. So I would say, ask yourself what you sincerely believe, and then regard it as your philosophical obligation to describe how that can be the case, or how that can be justified.
But isn't that exactly what Hume does? And what he shows is that how it can be the case is only partly answered by rational analysis, right?
Yes. And I agree with that.
In other words, it almost feels to me like you feel like that. Look, Hume and Kant represent sort of the opposite inclinations, right? When Hume hits a skeptical paradox, he thinks that's where philosophizing ends. Kant thinks that's where it begins, right?
True.
And for Kant, then, what happens is because Kant either isn't smart enough or he just agrees to actually defeat the Humean skeptical dissent, right? He goes transcendental.
Yes.
Which I would argue actually at the end of the day, answers nothing, right?
I agree.
I think it's ultimately a gigantic exercise in folly, right?
Agree.
That's not to say that I don't think that there's a gazillion things that are really interesting that come out of Kant that are really useful and you can go all over the place with. Just systematically, I don't see how he ever overcomes Hume just by going transcendental, because there's something large artificial about the transcendental move, right?
That shows you how devastating Hume is, right?
Right.
I'm not sitting here answering Hume either. But
I almost feel a little bit like what you're saying is that philosophy does need to bulldoze through that skeptical barrier, and that it should not take the special skeptical barrier as a limit. And maybe this is the reason why you like a lot of this sort of continental and more the stuff that's in the idealistic tradition, even though you're not an idealist, and you like substantive metaphysics and all that. But I guess that while I respect the fact that you want to do that, I don't see why that makes the person who takes the Humean attitude hypocritical, right?
Well, I mean, hypocritical just in the sense, like he just says it, as an agent, I am quite satisfied as to these truths. As a philosopher, I want to know the basis of the inferences.
Right.
Is he
what's wrong with the idea that, look, philosophically, I can show that my belief that I exist as an enduring self is not rationally sustainable.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, when I walk out of here, I'm going to interact with everybody as if I am an enduring individual person. I'm going to hold people responsible as if they were enduring. Now, what does that show? That shows that human beings don't believe things and do things solely on the basis of what can be rationally demonstrated. It shows that we're not simply rational beings. Now, why is that hypocritical as opposed to really understanding yourself pretty damn well, right? As opposed to pretending that you're a Cartesian ego with a Platonic mind right inside of it.
Right. So philosophers should stop pretending that, and as they do philosophy. Oh,
I see. You're saying, I see. You're saying that you want philosophy to become less rationalistic.
Yes.
And then it would get more mileage out of it then, right?
Yes.
Completely. I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, rationality strands Hume or whatever.
Yeah. No, look,
I think.
Yeah.
Now I think he needs to compromise. He needs to. I mean, ordinary language philosophy might be able to help a little bit.
There's an interesting parallel here. I just spoke with Massimo Pigliucci not long ago, and there's an interesting parallel here with science, right? People who have a narrower, tighter view of what constitutes science, people who have a broader view, and they get into these fierce arguments, and you realize actually, probably extensionally, they're all have the same views. It's just that for this guy, science is this very tight package, and then all this other stuff is sort of not science, but it's fine, right? And then for the other guy, it's like, in other words, it's fine not to be science, right? And then for the other guy, no, science is much broader, and so much more things count as science, and that's fine also. And
but it's not fine not to be science. It's not fine not to be science, because science, for a lot of people, is kind of the exclusive outlet of the truth.
Right, so typically those people, though, other than the sort of the demented ones, right, they simply broaden the concept of science so much that now everything, like someone like Lawrence Krauss thinks that mathematics is science. He thinks that morality is science. He thinks that all of these things are science. And that's just the result of expanding his notion of science now where it includes any epistemic activity, right?
Okay.
There is a type of person that has a narrow view of science and then also says everything outside is shit. Right. And those are very weird people, right? When you deal with those people, you're just like, they're usually socially very awkward and sort of.
Well, no, I hear people informally doing that all the time. Yeah. I mean, I hear professors doing that all the time, kind of like, if it's not science, it's not respectable, and plus, and if it is science, you better accept it right now. Okay.
It's becoming very dogmatic, which is, I guess, disturbing. It almost is sort of Asimovian, right? I mean, if you read Foundation, anyway, for those who have read Foundation, it gets the decline of galactic civilization gets to the point to which nobody actually remembers how anything works anymore. And so scientists turn into a priesthood, right? The manuals are now the scriptures, right? And they follow them, but they actually don't understand, right? I don't know what any of it says. And I almost feel like we're getting that way with science now. I mean, people invoke science as if it's like a divine authority.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you accept science?
Yeah, and it's
I've been asked that.
As if science always points in one direction, or as if science's conclusions were ever anything but provisional. And let me ask you. So I think we're doing pretty well in terms of general orientations and sort of trying to get an understanding of why, sort of as a whole, you kind of reject or dislike this approach to philosophy. You really, what it comes down to, it sounds to me, is like, you think that part of the issue here is that people are drawing too narrow a picture of philosophy as a specific technical activity, and thus
Yes.
having to end up with sort of Humean or Wittgensteinian kind of conclusion, where you'd like to broaden it. In that sense, I do think you have a more of a classical or Greco-Roman kind of conception of philosophy.
Maybe so.
Maybe let's talk at the time we have left a little specifically, though, now about Wittgenstein. Okay. And so, because there's a few things I think he did that are of such tremendous significance that I don't see how you could ever conclude historically that he was anything but an absolutely essential figure. And so there's two things I'm going to just talk about in particular. This is what I emailed you about, right? One is anti-representationalism, okay? And the second is how to deal with skepticism. And so...
Will you say what you think he mean, like what his anti-representationalism...
Right, so yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, here's a standard view, and it's a view, by the way, that goes well into our days, okay? And so, when you and I were in graduate school and college and grad school, and that is that the meaning in language ultimately is a function of meaning in the mind, okay? Right? So where language gets its content is from a prior mental content, right? This is Jerry Fodor's mentalese, right?
Yes.
This is pretty much all cognitive science, right? And in my view, it is one of the hugest wrong terms philosophy has ever taken. It has basically made the last 40 to 50 years of philosophy of mind almost entirely worthless, and useless. And Wittgenstein is the solution to it. He explains the private language argument explains why none of it works, right? Now, do you not, I don't think you're a fan of representationalism, right? I mean,
usually when I'm attacking representationalism, I kind of mean as a theory of mind. I'm more like in the empiricist, rationalist history.
Well, I think it actually refutes that too.
Yeah. Right? Where to see an object is to have an image, or an idea, like a picture, a representation in the mind.
That's right.
And I completely reject that.
Yeah.
And actually I think, and then the way he applies this to the linguistic situation is really fascinating and really, and I agree with the move that is, and I like to, I mean, first of all, there are accomplishments here, especially in the investigations.
Yeah.
The family resemblance stuff, okay. Fun.
That's another area. Yeah. I mean, up until then, people had this ridiculous view that, every word had a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for its application.
I got to give it up for that, man.
Then you find out, wait a minute, no words are like that except for like 3 words in geometry.
Yeah, exactly.
But just to stay on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Wittgenstein's representationalism. I mean, I'm going to let you keep formulating or whatever. I guess what worries me about it, and maybe again I'm getting this from Rorty a little bit, I want to empty the representation into the external world, and I feel like he wants to intensify it in a certain way. Like, in other words, like there's no, I don't know. I'm not sure what his position on this is, but if there is a position exactly, but.
The position is that meaning is ultimately public, not private, right? And so because at the heart of meaning, at the heart of concept formation, is our rule-governed activities, right? And that you cannot follow a rule in isolation from a community of agreements of that consists of sets of agreements, right? And so you can't internalize meaning because meaning is ultimately public. And so the relevant place where you're going to do your sort of analysis is going to ultimately be sociological. It's going to be out in the community and in their practices and customs, not in the internals of the brain. I mean, these people really think that. I mean, you read Fodor, right? He really thinks that there are like things inside your head that intrinsically mean something, right?
Yeah.
And Wittgenstein shows why that it cannot be, right? It's not just that it's wrong. It couldn't be right because of the ultimately rule-governed nature of meaning, and because of the ultimately public nature of rules, right?
And I think he's convincing on that. I really do. Yeah. And that's rather important. I think he could be clearer about it too. Like, I would like him to flatly state his conclusions, but I understand it's against his religion.
Well, let me ask you know what? Let's take a detour on that for a minute, because I don't think this will take very long. So I really like that, and I'll tell you why. I mean, it seems to me, look, talk about not being hypocritical, right? This is the opposite of being hypocritical. If you think that a lot of philosophical problems are essentially mistakes in that they proceed on the basis of a false assumption, right? Then the last thing you should expect such a person to do is make a bunch of philosophical proclamations. In other words, the fact that he asks mostly asks questions.
Yes.
And to the extent that he gives answers, 70% of them are intended to be incorrect.
Right.
In my mind, that speaks to me of a person who deeply understands that there are not conclusive answers to these things, because the questions either may be ill-formed or ill-understood.
Right,
and so the best thing to do then is to ask them in a provocative way so that the reader engages with the question.
Right. I can see that. But you just reconstructed his positions in a fairly clear, definite, attacking this tradition sort of way.
Yes.
And everyone has been doing that with Wittgenstein ever since, and often in contradictory modes, okay? Like, they disagree completely about what the conclusions are. And I just think he could have done a little more of that. Like, it seems to me a little bit disingenuous. Like I feel he has conclusions.
He had very strong views, but then when he writes, he acts as if he doesn't, is what you sort of don't like about it.
Yeah, a little bit.
Fair enough.
But back to the actual stuff, like, a little bit.
Yeah.
So I guess, like, the way I was thinking about this back in the day anyway, I want out of the social, I want out of the linguistic into the material external world. And I'm not sure I'm seeing that in Wittgenstein, right? Like, it's all a matter of social practices, language games. Whereas, I want meanings that extend into the world. Now, I'm not sure that anything he says is quite incompatible with that, but just the picture is relentlessly social and relentlessly limited to language in terms of meanings and so on.
Well, what do you mean by the world? Look, he wants to take it out of the head.
Yes.
Put it into the social practices, right?
Yes.
Now you say, well, I want it to go beyond the social practices to the world. What do you mean? To the trees and the rocks and the lakes and stuff? Right. So we talked about that entanglements. I guess I just find that ultimately obscure, right? Because, in part, I do accept the sort of basic Salarzian distinction between the scientific and the manifest image. And I think that the scientific image tells us a lot, right? But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell us anything about the sort of the essentially teleological practices of people, right? The practices that, in a sense, have a normative dimension, as all of our practices do. Our epistemic practices are obviously our political practices are, right? And Sellars actually says that normativity is sort of like is the fundamental quality of the social. That's partly why he's an anti-reductionist. And the two images have to be kind of superimposed to get a complete picture, because they have an entirely different internal structure, right? They have an entirely different set of fundamental principles and entities.
I think we've argued about this. I disagree with this.
The fundamental principle, the fundamental entities, if you want to call that, of the manifest image are persons, right? The fundamental entities in the scientific image is going to be some sort of subatomic particle, right? And what you get from that is an entirely different. I don't see how you're going to get moral practices out of trees and rocks, right?
Well, you're not going to get any moral practices without stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to have to build some buildings and stuff like this. You're going to have to sail across the lake to meet somebody.
That's true, but that doesn't mean that the lake is in any way interestingly involved in, for example, the rules and guidelines that we set up for how people are allowed to behave when they go to the lake, right? I mean...
Well, the lake is involved in the meaning of the word lake.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
the word refers to lakes.
Yeah. And language has the basic function of language, if you ask me, is probably adaptation to an external environment. All right. So
are you a reductionist? Do you think that the social reduces to some material set of descriptors? I do. Like, we're material objects, just like trees and lakes. We'll have to talk about that another time, because I'm a very, very enthusiastic anti-reductionist. And I don't think that
I'm not proposing a reduction. I mean, but I'm proposing ontological equivalence. Like, persons and social practices are on the same ontological level as lakes and trees.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that on a separate occasion, because one of the things that I would say is one of the arguments I would give against that is that ultimately I think I can argue that reasons are distinct from causes, right? And that once we understand sort of how reasons operate, we'll understand that the sphere in which they operate is a very different kind of sphere than the sphere of causality. But we talk about that another time. It's way off on this.
So that's two different ways that events come to occur, through reasons and through causes.
Well, more that when somebody gives a reason for doing something, he's doing a very different kind of thing than when he gives the cause of something, when he identifies the cause of something.
Okay.
Now, since Davidson, reasons and causes have gotten collapsed together. Davidson is famous for arguing that reasons are causes. This is what got us the whole, in my view, rabbit hole of reductionist and materialist psychology in ways that I think is a bad idea. We'll talk about it another time.
Yeah.
Okay, so we both kind of like the anti-representationalism. Maybe you wish that he'd gone further. You don't think that it should stop at the social.
Yes.
That's fine. But you do accept that sort of this was a valuable contribution. Certainly, we both disagree with the mentalistic kind of approach to a lot of these philosophical questions. Let's ask about. So the other one is uncertainty, right? That one you really kind of dissed in our exchange, and in my view, I find that funny because you like G.E. Moore so much.
I do.
In my view, uncertainty basically is simply articulating what Moore left unstated and providing a kind of a frame in which it makes sense. And I also think it is the only approach to skepticism that I've ever seen that I actually think works. So what do you dislike about uncertainty?
All right. Well, one thing I'll say is, like, it's quite typical of Wittgenstein interpretation that you think he's basically agreeing with Moore or supplementing Moore.
He's fleshing out what in Moore is left largely implicit.
Yeah. And I think that he spends the whole book attacking Moore. But it's, that you could come through a book this size and not know that, not be certain that whether the whole book is devoted to elaborating and agreeing, spelling out and correcting Moore, or the whole book is devoted to destroying Moore. That doesn't seem to me like, that's not how I would want to write a philosophy book. Like, leaving people with questions like that, like, are you saying P or not P at the end about the whole theme of the book? Right. But you may well be right.
Look, this is so, I mean, look, I hate to saddle philosophers with this, right? I mean, look, we just mentioned Sellers, right? Everyone from Rorty to the Churchlands claims Sellers, right? Now, I mean, that can't be, right? I mean, and is that a fault of Sellers, or is that a fault that people are so fucking partisan, even in intellectual circles, that they want to claim things, and rather than say, "Wow, this stuff is really hard," and because it's so hard and the issues are so sort of fundamental and at a certain level abstract, there's a lot of ways you could go on it, right? I mean, it's not
Okay.
obvious, right? Instead, they say, oh, yes, it's obvious in this one direction. And so now it looks like there are 15 completely contradictory interpretations of Sellers, but that's not Sellers' fault. That's the interpreter's fault, it seems to me.
That's true, although I feel like Wittgenstein is a particularly bad case of this. You know, you can't tell whether he's saying the same thing in the Tractatus as the Philosophical Investigations or just the opposite.
Yeah.
You know, you can't tell. You know, the disagreements are fundamental, and they're
true of Kant also.
By the text.
It's true of Kant. The whole analytic continental split comes out of a disagreement over how to interpret Kant, right? I mean,
well, I wish Kant had been clearer too.
Yeah,
you know,
not much is going to be left if you're going to saddle the author with contradictory interpretations. There's not going to be much left, right? I mean,
all right. So, but let me ask you this. All right.
Yeah.
I'm G.E. Moore.
Yeah.
I really am, man. Like the reincarnation, baby. Yeah. And I'm going. And here's a hand, and here's another. Now, I say I know that. Does Wittgenstein agree or not?
Yes. Yes.
He does.
Yes.
Okay. So it's a non-empirical.
No, I tell you. No, listen. If you want me to run what I think the argument on uncertainty is, I can do it in like 3 minutes. It's actually, I think, very simple, and I actually think it's actually somewhat Carnapian, the logic of it, right? So look, here's what Moore says. Moore says, "Here's a hand, there's a hand." Now, it's not as if Moore is not aware of the illusion arguments, right?
Oh yeah,
not as if he's not aware of them. Part of his point, what he said, and I think he actually says this explicitly, is that the problem is that none of the arguments, in other words, none of the arguments against it are as compelling as the thing that they're arguments against, right? I mean, and that's sort of the appeal to common sense.
Yes.
But I think that Wittgenstein offers a way to make the appeal to common sense not simply a hand wave.
Okay.
Because look, the inevitable response is to just point out to Moore all the 15,000 ways in which your common sense goes wrong, right? So, you know, you can't just sort of hold that up as a totem and then walk away, which is why I think most people think that ultimately the paper is a failure. Not because it couldn't work, but because it's got too hand wavy of an appeal to common sense. He doesn't sort of unpack, okay, well, wait a minute. What is it about this that makes it more plausible than any of the arguments you could ever amass against it? What's going on there? Okay, and I think Wittgenstein shows it. So,
I think of Moore as by the way, as attacking Hume, right? In the sense, the way we framed it.
He's attacking, yes.
He's saying like he's plopping for the agent rather than the philosopher, and he's saying like, all the knowledge is occurring on this level,
right?
And this is good enough, you know, like that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And I think though that Hume is also, there's a substantial disagreement on the interpretation of Hume. I tend towards the Norman Kemp Smith interpretation that humans ultimately should be viewed as a naturalist and not a skeptic, in which case Hume should be read more like Thomas Reid and a lot less like Berkeley, right? I mean, and so I think that actually Hume agrees with Moore, I think, actually.
Okay, that's not implausible. Of course, Hume calls himself a skeptic over and over again, but you know.
Yeah, and I think that's unfortunate, but I do think if you actually look at the structure of the treatise, that it's pretty clear that the section of the understanding is being set up for a reductio that then gets cashed out in the section on the passions, right?
It leaves you in common sense reality in some way.
Yeah, and this has been, people have been going back and forth. Kemp Smith wrote his book in the 50s, and people this was the reigning view of Hume for a while, and then it came back around. No, he's really a skeptic after all. I don't get into history of ideas fights.
Okay.
Fine, if that's not Hume, then it's Hume Star. Hume Star is really great. Okay. But here's what I think Wittgenstein's sort of the argument is, and that is that skepticism makes the mistake of treating all the propositions or beliefs within a system as having the same character and as being on the same sorts of grounds, right?
Okay.
This is the whole thing about without the hinges, the door doesn't open, right? And so you can't have doors without hinges. So if we're going to talk about doors, then certain things have to stand fast, right? Right. And, you know, if I'm going to talk about the solar system, right, I can doubt whether Saturn is older than, let's say, Jupiter, right? But I can't doubt that there are planets and still be talking about planets. Okay, and in other words, there is a you
can't doubt that there are planets and not be talking about planets, right? I mean,
what?
You're talking about planets when you say, I doubt there are planets.
I can't engage in a discourse without certain things standing fast, right? The idea that justifications go all the way down to the bottom, that's just your old school foundationalism, and it's false, right? And the reason it's false...
I read Wittgenstein as asserting that over and over.
He's saying the opposite of that. In order for the doors to open, the hinges have to stay put, right?
Over and over again, he says things like, I could not prove it, so I didn't know it. I couldn't produce decisive reasons, could I? And that's a conceptual condition on knowledge. Like, I think he's like a screeching justificationist in this.
He's exactly the opposite of that. He's
all right, well, that's
exactly the opposite. He's an anti-foundationalist. He's one of the most prominent anti-foundationalists in the history of philosophy. The whole point is that certain things have to stand fast in order for an inquiry to even take place. And what the skeptic does is, in a sense, undermine the very basis for the inquiry one is involved in, right? The skeptic mistakenly and look, this is sort of similar to a somewhat Carnapian point, right? And that is that, you know, once you're talking within a frame of reference, right? There's certain questions you cannot ask because the very frame presupposes that they're there, right? Which is why he says when you ask external questions, you kind of misunderstand what kind of a question you're asking. And what Hume is suggesting is that the skeptic misunderstands the beliefs that he's challenging. He thinks that the belief that there are planets is like the belief that Saturn has 6 moons, right?
I think so too, though.
No, but I don't. I mean, relative to discourse on planets, that there are planets is a hinged proposition.
Well, no. I mean, there could be a universe in which you can talk about planets, but there are no planets. I mean.
Wait a minute. But look, this is some of the. This is why
an empirical proposition.
This is why it's stupid to go to an astronomer and say, "Well, how the hell can you be talking about the solar system when you can't even prove that material objects exist at all?" Right? And what he's going to say is, "Excuse me. First of all, get the fuck off my lawn. Second of all, I'm engaged in a practice. That practice is the practice of talking about our solar system. And guess what? It presupposes that material things exist, and thus that question is not relevant to the discourse."
That's true.
In other words, the point Wittgenstein is making in Uncertainty is the fundamental anti-foundationalist point. It's that reasons have to come to an end. He says that explicitly, right? At some point, reasons come to an end. And that's because practices have to presuppose that certain things stand fast. Otherwise, you can't have practices.
Right, but I think one reason they stand fast quite often is that they're true. Obviously true. Like, here is a hand and here's another. Or there are planets. Okay?
His point is that the skeptic can challenge that.
Of course he can.
He can start running an illusion argument. And look, I agree with Hume. I don't think ultimately the questions are answerable head on. If you go head on, the skeptic wins every single time.
I disagree. I mean, but I think this is a lot of.
I'd like to see
a lot of work.
I'd like to see you produce, either yourself or in anybody else, an actual successful head-on conclusive refutation of the skeptic. I don't think it can be done. Robert Nozick didn't think. I mean, this has been going on for hundreds of years. I'm surprised that you actually think that. I
think that Moore refuted skepticism. I think here's a hand, here's another refuted skepticism.
If you take him at face value, he did nothing of the sort. He just begged every question.
Okay, I understand why you say that, man.
And what Wittgenstein's doing, I think, is unpacking what he's saying. Look, no, don't dismiss Hume more so fast. Yeah, he kind of said it in a hand-wavy way, and he made a kind of a fool of himself with some of the things he said about what he knows for certain. And it turns out, actually, he's like, I know for certain there's something outside the window. It turned out he was in a different room, and there was nothing outside the window.
What? I don't know, man.
So the point just is that look, if you take more deadpan, it's a fucking laughable joke. Okay, nobody thinks it succeeded except for you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, however, in my view, what uncertainty is doing is saying, look, here's how you can interpret more in a non-hand wavy way.
Okay.
Right, and that is that what Moore is pointing out when he says that the belief that the hand is real is stronger than any of the arguments against it.
Yes.
That's because the proposition that there is a hand in ordinary discourse is a kind of hinge proposition, right? Because if we're talking about people and we're talking about the things they do things with their hands, that all presupposes that there are hands. Right? Just like if I'm doing science at all, it presumes that there are material objects. That's why for a skeptic to go to an astronomer and say, you need to stop what you're doing until you prove the material world exists is foolish, right? Because it rejects the idea that there are any practices.
Right. Okay, I agree. Now
that's it. That's the whole thing.
Okay, good. Now when Wittgenstein addresses Moore, he relentlessly points out that Moore is still subject to skeptical doubts. Okay, that here's a hand and here's another still
because of the way he formulates it.
And then Wittgenstein says if he can't prove it in the face of skeptical doubts, he doesn't know it at all. Okay, now that is it's ambiguous whether he says that.
Why does he also say that to deny that I have a hand? If someone seriously asked me that, I would think he was a half-wit.
Right. Well, that's what Moore says too. Okay.
Right, but in Wittgenstein, there's actually an explanation of why that would be the case, and that's because the person would misunderstand the type of inquiry he's engaged in. Right? Moore doesn't explain why. Wittgenstein does.
He asserts that Moore cannot know that here is a hand and here is another on the grounds that knowledge is a concept that requires rigorous justification or deductive proof even. All right? So I think he is bringing to Moore the most traditional, and for him, really, it should be the most nonsensical theory of justice that you ever heard, a theory of justification or theory of knowledge that you ever heard. In other words, he's bringing this philosophical concept of knowledge to bear, ignoring how we actually use the word know, okay, which I think quite encompasses here is a hand and here is another. Regarding knowledge as this technical philosophical term instead of an ordinary word that we exchange all day anyway. All right.
So what is your answer? Okay, fine. So let's say you don't accept either of Wittgenstein's effort to sort of fill in what Moore leaves out, or if you want to take the view as you seem to do that he's actually opposed to Moore, which I don't agree with.
Yeah, okay.
But we can fight that to death. There's no point in it.
Yeah.
I'm just leaving it out there. But then you tell me on your own view how you cash out Moore's claim that the claim that there's a hand is more credible than any of the arguments against it. Now I say to you, no, it isn't. Now what? Now what are you going to do? No, it isn't.
I don't mean this as a threat.
Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Over and over again.
Well, I might slap you. And I don't mean this as a threat.
But you know what I mean, right? I
might keep waving it around, man.
It's cheap. It's cheap, though, because everybody knows that the whole point of the philosophical inquiry, right? Even Berkeley thinks you have a hand in that sense. Okay.
I'm asking you whether you really believe there's a hand here or not. And if you really don't,
Berkeley believes there's a hand. Berkeley believes there's a hand.
Right.
He just disagrees with a certain analysis of what that means. Right.
Okay.
And so it's not enough to just sort of, wave your hand. I mean, it's cheap, man. It's cheap when we're doing philosophy. Now, you want to say, well, philosophy is just like everything else. No, it isn't. And people don't walk around doubting this stuff.
Well, sure they do. I mean, they might have people think themselves into the dream argument at a young age and things like that.
People walk around,
sure whether they're
other than very sick, mentally ill people walk around on the basis seriously doubting whether they have hands or not.
No. And that's actually my point. You're not doubting it. I'm not doubting it.
The skeptical analysis of it is, but then the skeptical analysis of that is unnatural. It's not normal. It's extraordinary. And if you're going to engage in it, then you acknowledge you're engaging in something extraordinary. So it's not an answer to say, oh, wait a minute, as if Berkeley doesn't know that, right? I mean, look, an uncharitable interpretation of Moore, in my view, makes Moore out to be pretty damn stupid.
Right, it does.
You think Moore that you don't know, that Berkeley doesn't know that? And I don't think Moore knew that. I think Moore knew very well that Berkeley knows that. I just think that Moore thought that he could get more mileage out of simply sort of gesturing that way.
Yes.
Than I think you can, right? And especially given that at Moore's day, a kind of Berkeleyanism was surging in the form of the positivist, right?
That's true.
And so it was important to not just sort of go like this, because look, if that would have worked, Berkeley would have stayed away. But he came back in the form of Ayer and all these other guys, right? And so you can't just wave your hand again. Now you have to say something.
I mean, all right, the way I would try, I mean, I don't know. Like, this is pretty deep, though. I mean, I would say that, Berkeley knows that here's a hand and here's another. Moore knows it. Wittgenstein, too. And that's where we have to start, okay? Like, there's a datum. We know that here's a hand and here's another.
Right. But philosophy is interesting. How do you know
that could be the case?
Philosophy is interesting. How do you know that, and what is it to know that? Okay.
Well, we do know it, would be my view. And now it's philosophy's task to describe how we know it. What does it mean to say we know it?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so one way of trying to show how we know it is the way that goes from Descartes through to Locke, right? Who are much more similar than they are different. Right, yes. In terms of the basic picture, right?
Definitely.
And Berkeley shows, that picture actually leads you to conclude that hands are mental objects, right?
Right.
Now, Hume comes along, in my view, and says, well, that's because you're misunderstanding what the skeptic is doing, right? Because I interpret Hume as a naturalist.
Okay.
Moore comes along when there's about to be a resurgent Lockeanism, a resurgent representationalism. Moore comes along and just goes like this, right?
Yeah.
Now that's not an answer. It could be. It's the beginning of an answer. But in my view, what Wittgenstein does is point out the obvious problem. Listen, you don't even need all these kind of personalities. You can just do Descartes and make this point, right? Right. I justify the belief that there's a table in front of me on the basis of my senses. Okay.
Right.
Now, if I ask you the question, well, how do I justify the belief that my senses are reliable? I obviously can't make another appeal to my senses. That's going to be circular, right?
Right. And if you can't do that, then you can't show that.
Right. So and so hence you end up in the skeptical hole. You end up in there in 30 seconds, right? What Wittgenstein argues is that, look, what you're ignoring is the fact that you're engaged in a practice. The practice presupposes certain things. Now, you can question, within the context of the practice, you can question all kinds of things, but you can't question the predicate upon which the practices rest, right? Otherwise, you're not engaged in the practices anymore.
Okay.
And so what that means is that the way that you explain what the significance of this is that the belief that there's a hand has a different kind of status within a whole bunch of practices than the belief that, hands are for waving, or the belief that some people are miss one but have another, or in other words, it's to make you understand that the skeptic's questions may grammatically look like other sorts of questions.
Yes.
But they're actually illicit in a certain way because they ignore the fact that all practices, including epistemic ones, depend on certain things standing fast, which means you can't apply the question to them. Right. Without ceasing to be engaged in the practice.
Okay.
Includes epistemic practices.
Is the assertion of the existence of anything like philosophy on holiday or something like that, or language on holiday, or does he ultimately? All right. Does he think that Moore knows that here's a hand and here's another?
I think he knows that, and I think he thinks that we all know it. But I think that
I think you can get to the end of this book and not know whether he thinks that or not.
The skeptical arguments against it, I think he says, are only successfully overcome. So if you take the skeptical arguments being unanswered as a barrier to being able to say, I know that I have a hand.
Yes, and he does, I think.
Then the only way to do that is to show that the skeptic is, in some sense, making a kind of mistake.
Okay.
And in my view, the mistake is in treating claims like there's a hand as similar to claims as people's hands often get dirty, right?
I think it is similar. I mean,
then I think you're left without an answer to the skeptic, other than waving your hand and hitting the guy when he says, "I'm sorry, I don't find that persuasive at all. I find the arguments very persuasive." Right?
And maybe with more, I don't think I need an answer to the skeptic. Or I'm willing to sit there and say, I can't prove it, okay? I can't even give like a convincing argument for it in the face of these considerations. But guess what? I take myself to know it. And, and that means that it's true, okay? Then I believe it.
But then don't you feel, that's sort of, in my view, I actually think it diminishes more. It turns more into nothing more than Samuel Johnson kicking the stone.
Yes. I love that too.
I think it's cheap.
It's trying to show you what you really believe, man. And it's trying to insist that you say in philosophy what you believe.
I think actually it's the abandonment of philosophy. I think what it is it's saying, look, let's just, which is funny because I thought you were all hyped for it. I thought you were all into pushing past the barrier and, not seeing skepticism as the end of inquiry as the beginning. And now what I find out is you just want everybody to just fall back on unreflective common sense.
I think we ought to re-articulate philosophy in this way. Like, it's not going to be a structure of pure reasoning to justify conclusions. It's a part of human life that muddles about, So I don't think I want to change philosophy. That's for sure. I think that's what Moore is doing, right? He's saying, like, I'm going to say, qua philosopher, exactly what I do actually believe. So let's start there. All right. Now let's see what can be justified, what not, but at least let's go for some kind of sincerity on this or whatever,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, it's interesting. It's funny. When we started, we agreed a lot. And as we're getting more, we know each other better and it's the disagreements starting to come out, and which I find, which to me is incredibly rewarding because I really like to see. I feel like I'm still trying to understand what your view is, right?
Okay, good.
And I almost feel like we need to go back to Entanglements because I still don't know if I think I understand. You seem to assimilate or accumulate together practices, mental processes, brute sort of matter, right? This whole thing with the knots and the threads and all that. I'm wondering actually if I actually didn't understand it.
Okay.
I thought maybe I thought I understood it better than I did, but because I know how sharp you are, I know when I'm saying to you, this is cheap and all that, I know you're not cheap. Which makes me think, okay, I'm still not getting where he's coming from.
No, it could be cheap, right? Because I agree with Moore. Okay, so, and surely that's an accusation against Moore. Like, here's a hand, here's another. That's a cheap refutation of skepticism or whatever. But I'm kind of endorsing that cheapness or something, or trying to reconstrue it in a way that's philosophically significant or something. I
guess part of what puzzles me is that in some modes and with some of the thinkers you like, you seem to be really hyped for super speculative, esoteric, metaphysical kind of thinking. And then on other fronts, you then seem to want to be like a guy who just sort of wants to sort of stick with unreflective common sense.
Well, I think those things
reject philosophical analysis, and I guess because I'm inclined to be charitable, I don't think you're being inconsistent. I suspect that there's something you have a way of thinking about this in mind that I'm not quite getting yet.
I want my metaphysics to, first of all, be compatible with my common sense and to reflect it. And, so I kind of like, I feel that my metaphysics, high flown as it is at points or whatever, very abstract as it is at points, is an attempt to capture my actual everyday experience and acknowledge its authenticity and acknowledge my commitment to it, as an agent and stuff like this. That's where I want to start the project of figuring out what the universe is. Okay. And so I'm going to start with my ordinary experience and not undermine it. Let's see what happens. Like, I'm going to embrace it and use it to expand into the metaphysical realms and stuff like, or the questions about epistemology and so on, or the abstract philosophical questions. So that's, I don't think of that as a foundationalist move or anything, but I just, I want to start out sincerely stating what I believe, and then seeing like what I could, if I could create a philosophical picture, even of the whole thing, that's compatible with that or starts with that.
It almost feels to me like this phrase just came to my mind. I don't know whether this works or not, but it almost seems to me like in a weird way you want to deflate philosophy, but inflate life, right?
True.
In a sense, sort of, bring them like, do this with them.
Yeah.
Or
identify.
Or I think sort of, here's life. Philosophy's gone way up here, and I simply want to deflate philosophy, right? To where it's now, where it's reined into the. It seems to me you're sort of bringing them both, one down and one up.
Kinda. That's good. Thanks for that. Actually, I think that's right.
Yeah, it's sort of like you want to inflate the significance of this while simultaneously deflating the analysis of it.
Yeah, or the concept of knowledge or something.
Yeah.
In general.
Yeah. That's what it's starting to seem like to me. Anyway, this was really interesting. Didn't go how I expected, but that's great. And it's always
been great, Dan.
It's
really.
For the audience likes it a lot better when people yell at each other. You and I are such old, grizzled, battle-scarred people that we can do this, and if you were still a drinking man, go out and have a few afterwards.
That's true.
It's interesting today. People are so allergic to conflict, and conflict has become so toxic. But I think it's a good thing that people see people who like each other a lot really fighting.
Right on.
Because people then understand, they don't confuse intensity for hostility, right?
And that's what I liked about philosophy originally a lot. Just that you like a real deep, important conflict, which you're prosecuting at maximum, the maximum of your abilities. Yeah. But that can be fun for one thing, and it could be enlightening possibly as well.
Yeah, I really missed that. It's sort of, in the old days when I was in graduate school, you'd have the weekly colloquium, the speaker would come. People would not just brutalize the speaker would brutalize each other, and then after it all, you went up to the bar, and you all drank together and ate cheese and wine and cheese, and you realized, these people are just it's almost like sports, right?
Yes, I like that.
I think we've completely lost that now.
Yes,
philosophy is so brittle.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why we seem to agree so much, even though we disagree on almost everything, is because I think in that fundamental temperamental way, we both feel the same way about how this should be done.
I agree. Yeah. Did you read that Agnes Callard piece?
She's been, by the way, on Blogging Heads now, I think once or twice.
Okay.
She's one of the most interesting people. She's one of the most interesting people around right now.
Yeah, I think so too. And she had that piece, Is Philosophy a Fight Club, which is about this. Yeah,
and I wish more people would listen to her, actually.
Yes, I agree.
Anyway, thanks so much.
Thanks, Dan.
How's your semester going, all right?
Yeah, so far so good. Coming up on midterms,
Yeah,
going pretty good.
Yeah, mine's going pretty well also.
Yeah.
Anyway, I look forward to reading whatever you have next coming out. And looking forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Take care, my friend.
Peace.
Ciao.